Hello and a warm welcome to the South Asia Chat, brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Dr. Imran Ahmed, a consultant for the Institute. Today, we will be speaking about the Afghan peace process. With the recent elections in the US, tensions and divisions within the Afghan government, conflicting strategic interests in Afghanistan of its neighbors, and reoccurring Islamist insurgencies in the country, the future of Afghanistan appears more and more uncertain. Talks between the Taliban and Afghan government recently appear to be at a deadlock. The Afghanistan policy of the incoming Biden administration remains unclear. President Trump has also issued a call to diminish American military presence in the country. And Imran Khan's visit to Kabul has sought to signal efforts to alter and address historical sources of tension between the two nations. All of these developments in just this month alone suggest that Afghanistan and the geopolitical landscape of the broader region is a rapidly evolving situation. Thankfully, we have Dr. Zahid Shabab Ahmed to help us make some sense of these and other developments in the country. Dr. Zahid Ahmed is a research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. His research focuses on peace and security in South Asia and the Middle East. He previously served as an assistant professor at the Center of International Peace and Stability at the National University of Sciences and Technology in Islamabad. Dr. Zahid is a scholar as well as a practitioner, and his recent scholarly work has looked at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and Pakistan's relations with Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. He is often engaged in educational projects on countering violent extremism. Dr. Zahid, a warm welcome to you, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be part of this conversation.
Dr. Zahid, if you could please provide a brief historical overview of the Afghan peace process and tell us a little about the domestic and international stakeholders who are involved.
In February 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed a peace deal in Qatar. And this naturally raised the hopes that nearly after 18 years of war in Afghanistan, there would be peace. A key feature of the agreement is that the US will completely withdraw its troops within 14 months of the deal. So that ends next year. If the Taliban uphold their commitments, the deal also includes mainly a prisoner swap involving 5,000 Taliban prisoners in exchange for 1,000 Afghan security forces prisoners. And there has already been some progress in this regard because the Afghan government has released close to 4,000 of the Taliban prisoners. There were some differences with regard to 10 or so prisoners that the Afghan government did not want to release, but ultimately the matter has been handled. But what is important with reference to the Afghan peace process is the very fact that it is now more complicated. The context in terms of the engagement of external actors is more complicated than ever before. If we compare it, for example, the 1980s, now we have more actors very different from the Cold War era. Now we have Pakistan's engagement in Afghanistan that has increased since the 80s. There is Iran, there's China and Russia, and of course the United States. And India and the Afghan government, on the other hand, they see the Taliban as Pakistan's proxy and believe that the current peace deal between the US and the Taliban undermines the Afghan government and offers a greater role to Pakistan. Pakistan and other actors, other regional actors like Iran, China, and Russia, they are on the same page with regard to where this peace process should head. For example, they are in agreement that there should be complete US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. there is also some consensus now among various actors that there should be some negotiation with the Taliban, and the Taliban have been given some kind of international legitimacy. And this is mainly because of their territorial gains. In terms of the war, they have gained more and more territories. As far as some estimates, they already control 1/3 of the country. Another 1/3 is contested between the Taliban and the government forces or the international forces. But I would like to maybe say more about how some actors have engaged in the peace process, and they all have their own stakes. Some have similar to the others in terms of their interests. Pakistan, of course, wants a pro-Pakistan government in Kabul, which, if we look at the history, was mostly not the case, other than the Taliban government or the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which was there prior to 2001. And so Pakistan has facilitated some peace dialogues in Murree, closer to Islamabad, in 2015, and also has been supporting the US-led peace process and hosted the Taliban delegations even inside Pakistan's Foreign Office, which was the case in October 2019. Iran has developed some connection with the Taliban. I think their concern for now is to ensure that there is US troop withdrawal, but later on, if Taliban come into power in whichever way possible, I think Iran will have its own troubles with reference to Taliban's long history of treating the Shia minority in the country. For China, I think what is important, China has been hosting, Afghan peace dialogues for a while. For China, the main interest is, of course, in relation to its Belt and Road Initiative and its investment in Pakistan. So if it has to connect with Central Asia, it has to go through Afghanistan. And so the very destiny of China's investment in Pakistan is dependent on peace and stability in Afghanistan. Russia, I think, has been most effective in terms of peace dialogues that Moscow has organized, although even in those dialogues, Taliban never really agreed to a ceasefire, which was the case in 2017 and also in 2018. But what has to be appreciated, that the dialogues in Moscow were the most comprehensive in terms of the involvement of all the stakeholders, including the Afghan government. Even Indian delegation was present in one such meeting, Central Asian republics, and so on. Other dialogues had their limitations. For example, the recent Qatar agreement did not include the Afghan government. So this, in a way, is basically a summary of how, this is basically an overview of the Afghan peace process. And this tells us, in a way, that the situation is very complex in terms of the role of external actors who also have now some similar interests, but also divergent interests. And peace and stability in Afghanistan overall depends on these actors finding, some kind of consensus in relation to peace and stability in the country, which is dependent on these states. For example, Pakistan and India not engaging in any proxy war in Afghanistan.
Thank you for that. How have the Taliban evolved as a political force since the beginning of the war on terror? And what challenges do they pose for peace and stability in Afghanistan today?
I think it's a very important question, and one can talk about a range of factors, but let us first talk about the group itself. Despite the fact that it can be seen as a proxy of external actors, for example, Pakistan, and other actors who have helped the Taliban in various ways, there is no denying of the fact that the group has avoided any internal challenges. Normally you would see groups splitting into two and more subgroups. That has not been the case of the Taliban. We have only heard of the talk that there are good Taliban, there are bad Taliban, but as an organization, it has survived as a single entity. So then the organization, the Taliban, it doesn't really need external funding. That's a very important factor, as it has managed to fund itself through the illegal narcotics trade, valued between $700 to $200 million annually. I've read some sources that have valued that up to $500 million per annum as well. That's a lot of money for a group like the Taliban to buy weapons and to survive in any way possible. So because of their history, for example, the Mujahideen who fought against the Soviets in the 80s, they have very close relations with the military establishment in Pakistan. So if you know the history, you know how Pakistan was like a client state for the US in the Afghan-Soviet war throughout the 80s. And so naturally, Pakistan military, including the intelligence agency, they formed very close relations with these people who later on became key figures of the Taliban. And as far as Taliban's history is concerned, I think another important aspect we have to look at, that they emerged as an organization from the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Islam schools for the Afghan refugees in the 90s in Pakistan. So that's an important aspect. Whether Pakistan played a direct role in the creation or not, one can always question that. But since 2001, Pakistan has supported the Taliban in various ways by hosting, for example, their families, diplomatic support, for example, establishing links with China, links with other countries as well for the Taliban, medical support for the Taliban in Pakistan, travel documents. Many of the Taliban leaders have traveled on Pakistani passports. And this all is very well documented, and it's there's no hidden secret about the level of support that Pakistan has provided. The challenge, because some question that you asked about the challenge that the Taliban's rise, for example, poses. The challenge they pose to peace and security is that they have continued their attacks despite the peace deal with the US. They know how to benefit from the situation when the US is committed to withdraw from Afghanistan. I don't think so. They will relax until the point that there is complete US or foreign troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, and they also have some kind of intra-Afghan settlement. There are still dialogues going on between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and we are yet to see where it is headed. I think that's very important because that will give some indication. The Taliban have repeatedly rejected the idea of any ceasefire, even when there was a meeting in Moscow in, I think, 2017, 18, they completely rejected the idea of ceasefires. And this, in a way, of course, poses a serious challenge to peace and security, not only in Afghanistan, but also in South Asia.
What do you think is the political logic behind President Trump's decision to withdraw troops? And how do you think this will impact the peace process?
I think we have to understand the domestic politics in the United States and also its foreign affairs. Since the Cold War, I think the US has been engaged in many wars abroad. But if we look at Afghanistan, this is the longest ever military engagement for the US after the Vietnam War. It has been very costly in terms of not just the human loss in terms of the casualties reported of the US soldiers and soldiers of other NATO countries, but also civilian casualties in Afghanistan. But look at the economic cost to Afghanistan, to the US. So I looked at one report, and the figure is $778 billion during the period between 2001 and 2018. This is just a huge amount of money, and the war has been very costly. The Trump administration has always spoken about fixing the US economy, creating more jobs, and I think considering all these also domestic factors, and then unemployment rate, and of course the war hasn't achieved much for Afghanistan. It's in a simple way, if I call it, it has been a failure as far as the US is concerned, because the Taliban have emerged stronger than before as an actor in the country. And now many other countries have also realized the importance of negotiating with the Taliban. So they have gained some legitimacy, I think, and that is by virtue of their success in terms of gaining more territories in the country. So they directly control about 30 to 35% of the territory in Afghanistan, and indirectly, another 30% or so. So as far as the Afghan government is concerned, there's very little portion, 1/3 of the country, which is under their control. So they realize that they have gained successes and they want to materialize those successes. And so at the same time, from the Trump administration's point of view, I think President Donald Trump has been basically just trying to fulfill all his promises that were mentioned in his election manifesto when he won as the president of the US. And this is one of the pending items. So I think he would like to go ahead with the withdrawal. He had made the announcement of withdrawing a significant number of US troops by the Christmas this year. So we'll have to wait and see how he's going to make it happen.
Thank you very much. To follow on from the previous question, what kind of course corrections do you think the Biden administration will undertake? And how might these changes fare on the ground for the Afghan government?
This is a very difficult question, in my opinion. I don't think so. The Biden administration will opt for a continued war against the Taliban, especially following the peace deal. It's very difficult for any new government to backtrack on previous deals. Of course, Donald Trump did on a few occasions. There are a lot of examples of, for example, opting out of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, also NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, for example. But normally, new governments hesitate to backtrack on any of the significant agreements. Biden might like to delay the withdrawal of the US troops by keeping a couple of thousand troops in Afghanistan, but that won't help Afghanistan in any way. If the idea is to resist the return of the Taliban to power in the country, I don't think so. Keeping a couple of thousand US soldiers in Afghanistan will help the Afghan government in any way in terms of peace and stability in the country. I think everyone knows, they don't say it, but I think everyone knows that the Taliban are going to come sooner or later back to Kabul. And so I think it's too late also now for Biden to do anything. And again, I would say the same thing, that I don't think so he would opt for a full-fledged war against the Taliban, because that would be, I think, very, very costly considering how strong the Taliban are now.
To turn to our final question, Imran Khan's recent visit to Kabul brought forth statements from both sides which stated the desire to normalize relations and work together on intelligence sharing, regional security, economic connectivity, and political cooperation. Why is the Afghan-Pakistan relationship so critical to the peace process? What practical steps should be taken in order to build trust between the two nations? And what obstacles towards reconciliation can you foresee?
So in terms of intelligence sharing agreement, it's not new. There was another intelligence sharing agreement under the previous Pakistan government with Afghanistan. All these agreements have importance, but often symbolic, as it is very easy to backtrack whenever the situation is not right. Pakistan has always been the more powerful actor in the equation with Afghanistan, and an actor that has more influence in various ways. For example, trade for the landlocked Afghanistan. So whenever the situation is not right, of course, Pakistan has used the opportunity to close the border openings on the Durand line to pressurize Kabul. In fact, I recently co-authored a paper that compared the geopolitics of landlocked states through case studies of Nepal and Afghanistan. And so there was extensive research done on how coastal countries, in this case Pakistan, has often used its geographical advantage to pressurize Afghanistan. What both countries, I'm talking about Afghanistan and Pakistan, and others who are sincere for peace and stability in South Asia need to do is to work on building trust between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There's a long legacy of mistrust, despite the fact that Pakistan has hosted the largest number of Afghan refugees and so on. But there is still a long legacy of mistrust or strategic distrust, which is a term used in international relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There are many issues that continue to influence their relation. What continues to hurt Pakistan the most is the fact that Afghanistan was the first country to vote against Pakistan's UN membership after its independence in 1947. Then Kabul had mostly been pro-India than pro-Pakistan, so that there comes in the India factor, of course. Afghanistan has also refused to engage in security cooperation with Pakistan, for instance, in terms of training Afghan security forces. That in a way speaks a lot in terms of the level of trust deficit between both countries, because India provides training to Afghan security forces, but Afghanistan has not allowed Pakistan to do the same. And of course, I'll talk about these issues now. For example, in Pakistan, there is Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, a civil society movement asking for more rights in terms of Pashtun people's grievances against the state in Pakistan. And Pakistan authorities, especially the establishment, has always linked the movement with Afghan intelligence and the Indian intelligence as well. For example, with the National Directorate of Security, which is NDS of Afghanistan, and the RAW of India. And the talk of Indian influence on Afghan media as well. If you go to Islamabad, everyone talks about that there is Indian influence on Afghan media. I would say that's like purely a lot of conspiracy stuff, but it speaks a lot in terms of the level of mistrust they have. Another thing I've heard from Pakistani policymakers often is that they say that the people serving in Afghan government, they are pro-Indian because they had studied in India, for example. So there are a lot of these issues. There are also historic concerns on Pashtun nationalism being supported by Afghanistan. On the other hand, Afghanistan has always felt that Pakistan interferes in its internal affairs, for example, by supporting the Taliban. So then the question is, how can one address this level of trust deficit? I think through more dialogue at high level and security cooperation, and also more exchanges at the level of the civil society to build trust. So there, of course, both countries are engaged in some cooperation, or ideally should have cooperated more through SARC, which is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. Of course, SARC is not doing much at this stage. And I think the regional cooperation mechanism has to be revived. Shanghai Cooperation Organization is another, I think, opportunity through which India and Pakistan could also engage in some level of cooperation on Afghanistan, because there's no other way but towards peace and stability in Afghanistan by bypassing India and Pakistan, or the importance of a dialogue between New Delhi and Islamabad. So in terms of peace dialogues, what is important is that there should be the involvement of all actors. especially the Afghan government. It has to be involved in all the processes. In terms of bilateral exchanges, so there's some news. I'm always very happy to see that at the level of track 2, track 3, there's a lot happening between Afghanistan and Pakistan. I recently spoke to a youth exchange program participants from Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so it's always very encouraging to see that level of activity happening between both countries. Pakistan has now announced a lot of scholarships, thousands of scholarships for the Afghan students. And I think all of these steps, although may look very small, they would play a role in building trust. So trust building should be at the heart of Afghanistan-Pakistan relationship. The visit of Prime Minister Imran Khan of Pakistan to Afghanistan, I think is a very welcome move, and the joint statement that was produced as a result of that. I do hope that all the commitments or agreements that they have reached would be fulfilled, especially the intelligence sharing between the both countries, because that would play a key role in building trust at the bilateral levels, especially between the ISI of Pakistan and the NDS of Afghanistan. I think if they agree on some level of cooperation, that would play a very significant role in terms of building trust at the bilateral levels between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Dr. Zahid, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insights on the dynamics and evolving politics of the Afghan peace talks.
You're welcome, Dr. Imran, and I wish you all the best.
You're listening to South Asia Chat. If you wish to learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. Thank you very much.